What's going on, everyone? Welcome to Movie Emporium's most disappointing films of 2023, where I count down, as I love to do, the most disappointing films of 2023 itself. So, as you can imagine, worst, I'm not doing this year. Not because I don't, love talking about worst movies, because I love talking about the worst movies of the year. But there really wasn't that many bad movies, or I was just super busy to really count down the top 10 worst films of the year. So I figured, like everyone else, I do the most disappointing films of 2023, which will still have some really bad films. But, I still love worst lists. I still love reading them and watching them. I think, it's getting out of hand with the most disappointing and most worst. I know people work hard and work long hours on these films, but, sometimes they don't work, and we like to talk about them. That's the idea of being a critic. And I think sometimes it gets out of hand, but it is what it is. So with that said, this year's list will have 5 honorable mention or dishonorable or most disappointing honorable mentions, whatever you want to call it, and then top 10 type of thing, and then we'll get into the best in a couple other videos. So yeah, let's do it. Let's get into the 5 honorable mentions or dishonorable mentions or most disappointing mentions of the year. These are films that not necessarily were bad, but just kind of disappointing on my radar, to be fairly honest. So those 5 honorable or dishonorable or miserable mentions, or whatever you want to call them, include films like Scream 6, which of course was not a very good film in my book because of that ending. I know a lot of people like this film. Once again, that's why it's like dishonorable mention, because it's just not a very good movie. Still entertaining for what it's worth. Another one is the Super Mario Brothers movie. I just wasn't a huge fan of what they did with this film. I think it's a very fun, very pretty looking film. It just doesn't work in my book. Another one is Hypnotic. It's just a very bland film from Robert Rodriguez with Ben Affleck, and it is what it is. The next one is Elemental, which was Pixar's film. It's kind of crazy. I'm putting Pixar like a couple years in a row with films I don't like from their franchise, from their filmography. I need them to do something cool and inventive, and Elemental wasn't that. And the last one I saw pretty late, which of course is Maestro. This movie is getting a lot of awards contention, and I'm just not about it. Outside the acting, I just didn't really care for it too much, but it still has a lot of heart to it, so I did just put it in the dishonorable mentions. And those are 5 films I think didn't make the top 10 because they're not the worst I've ever seen, but they're just not great films. Fairly honest, that's kind of where I roll. So with that said, let's do the top 10 most disappointing films of 2023, and at number 10 we have Once again, I have to preface this by saying I still enjoyed the film. It just was really disappointing. That, of course, is David Fincher's The Killer. And The Killer was a film that I was really looking forward to because I love David Fincher. I think he's a very talented director. I think he does a lot of interesting, kind of weird, kind of creative stuff when it comes to his very cold nature of being a director. But this film just didn't hit me in any way. I think I wasn't a big fan of Michael Fassbender. I didn't like how this film was structured, and it just overall wasn't a great film, to be fairly honest, but it still entertained. It still had some interesting moments. I think Eric Messerschmitt's cinematography was pretty good. I think the score, of course, by Atticus Ross and Trent Reznor was really good, and I think there are some highlights, like what I think it was Tilda Swinton was in this movie was really good, but just overall, it's still number 10 on this list, but it is not the worst thing I've ever seen, so it's definitely not like a lower tier end David Fincher, but just not a great film. So anyways, that's number 10, and number 9 is So I was a huge fan of Chicken Run. Really love that film. Chicken Run: Dawn of the Nugget was a hugely disappointing film just because it didn't invent anything. It was very atypical by the book. I thought everybody tried outside of Zachary Levi, but it was a film that really just kind of went by the motions, didn't feel like true heart of Artemin, and maybe it's just because it's on Netflix, and I feel like sometimes they're given oversaturated budgets and not a lot of control that these films come out. So it wasn't a great film. It was still, like I said, it was still an entertaining film. I just didn't like it overall. I just thought it was really disappointing, which is crazy because Chicken Run, the original movie, was fantastic. One of the best anime films of the last few years of that point. And yeah, it's unfortunate, but that's where it lies. So at number 9 is Chicken Run, and at number 8 we have it depresses me and disappoints me to have to put Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, another film that was in my most anticipated on this most disappointing film list, because it should have been a winner. You know, you have James Mangold coming in to direct, you have Harrison Ford coming back, you have Phoebe Waller-Bridge, you have Mads Mikkelsen, you have all these great character actors coming back, or at least coming into this movie, and it was just a 2.5 hour slog, to be fairly honest. It had some moments where it was cool. I think the opening definitely works as an Indiana Jones opening, but it got lost in translation somewhere. Antonio Banderas is like completely miscast in this movie. There's some points where I feel like it works, but most of the time it doesn't. So that's why I ended up on most disappointing of 2023, which I have a feeling it's going to be on a lot of people's list because it just really wasn't a great film. So at number 8 is Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. Number 7 we have... Once again, a big directorial auteur doing a film that just completely underwhelmed in every sense of the form, and that was Ferrari. Ferrari was a film I was highly looking forward to. You know, it was a film with Adam Driver being directed by Michael Mann. You know, Adam Driver has been in a lot of great films, a very fantastic actor. Michael Mann is one of the great directors of all time. And it was a slog. It was boring. It wasn't great. The only thing that worked about it was the car chase sequences. And I don't know. It was a really disappointing film for what I was expecting. The trailers, once again, like I said in my review, were much more misleading than they should have been. And overall, I just wasn't a huge fan of it. So it's unfortunate. I think Penelope Cruz is fantastic in it. I think, having Patrick Dempsey as like an Italian driver was really odd, but overall, not a huge fan of it. Once again, a lot of people did like it, but I just wasn't a big fan. So that's number 7 on my most disappointing list. Number 6 is... So if I were to do a worst of the year, this would definitely be on it. But number 6, of course, is Fast X. Once again, has some interesting, fun sequences, but it has shown that the Fast and Furious franchise has kind of outlived its welcome. It's not a very good movie. It deals with a quote-unquote actual cliffhanger. It deals with a kid that somehow is with John Cena through the entire movie. It just has some of the worst dialogue. It's just not a very good movie, but still has some entertaining moments. Like I said, this is not a worst list, this is a most disappointing list, because even though I wasn't really hugely looking forward to this after Fast 9, I still felt like maybe they would have something. I still think Louis Leterrier is a pretty decent director, and in the end, I wasn't a huge fan of it. So at number 6 is Fast X, and at number 5 we have... There is times where great marketing outweighs the film itself, and Anyone But You was that film. I saw this literally the day before I'm recording this, and it was not a fun experience, to be fairly honest. It was a very boring film. It was a very sluggish film. I almost wanted to walk out of it. It's because the movie is so convoluted and weird, and like it has two characters that are so unlikable, and they're doing things that make no sense. And this is kind of my review. It's just not a very well put together film. I think there are some moments where it's entertaining, but for a film that could have been a real crowd pleaser, I don't think it works. It's an R-rated comedy coming out during Christmas, and at some point R-rated comedy should work. It happens. But it didn't happen here, and that's why it's so high on this list, because it's just extremely disappointing for a movie that could have been much more entertaining. So yeah, the halfway point of the top 10 is, of course, Anyone But You. And once again, Glenn Powell and Sydney Sweeney, there's chemistry there, but it just doesn't work on a whole. So number 5 is Anyone But You, and number 4 we have... So at number 4 is a film that I didn't necessarily say I was anticipating, but the concept and idea was very interesting. That, of course, is Disney's Wish. Now, the Wish Upon a Star is one of the most famous things Disney has ever created. When it was first sung in Pinocchio, is the idea of a story of this is also a movie I didn't review, but it's also a story of an idea of like, what would happen if this wishing star actually came down and disrupted the whole entire Disney universe and stuff like that. And there's some interesting ideas being thrown out there. The idea that the 7 dwarves are these 7 characters in this movie, and she's kind of like Cinderella, the main character. But it's all over the place. It's hackneyed. It's very boring. It doesn't make any sense. It's 90 minutes of schlock. I think Chris Pine is just not having fun in this movie. It's a movie trying to be like a Frozen or Moana, but it just doesn't work. It feels just a very kind of bland tale tale of something. So it's really disappointing. And once again, it wasn't high on my list to see anyways, but just going in hoping for the best with what Disney has been known for doing, it just, for an anime film, it just completely was it screwed the pooch, I guess you could say. So that's where I land on number 4, and number 3 through 1 are kind of the worst, but really the most disappointing films of the year. So they are. Now, David Gordon Green is a director that unfortunately has not been high on my list of films for the year. The Halloween franchise did not do any service for him at all, being a director for it. Now he's doing Exorcist a Believer. I said in my review that I was going to put this as like the worst film of the year, but there are 2 other films that could be the worst of the year or most disappointing. But it's not like I wasn't interested in this film, because I thought it could be kind of cool to take Ellen Burstyn and kind of throw into the pot or the mixer of doing a really interesting Exorcist movie. But this movie is just absolutely horrendous. It was bad. It was not good. They like misused Ellen Burstyn, who's like one of the main characters in the original Exorcist movie, who got an Oscar nomination. I just think at this point, David Gordon Green is just kind of ruining franchises, to be fairly honest. And I don't mean to say that as bad, like as the most negative thing in the world, because I think he's a very talented director. Look at George Washington and some of the stuff he worked with, like the Judd Apatow crew. But this is not a very good film. It's a really disappointing film, to be fairly honest. One of the most disappointing things I've seen this year, and it really shows in kind of how it plays out. So overall, at number 3 is Exorcist a Believer. Number 2 is So you could kind of interchange either of these top 2 films as most disappointing, just on the simple fact of what they represent. But Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania was a hugely disappointing film, and the reason for that is the move up of scheduling from the Marvels to Ant-Man really hurt it with its kind of visual effects flair, and even the Marvels the same way. I don't think it was a very entertaining film. I think it was all over the place cinematically. I think, using the Corey character, or the character from the first Ant-Man, as, of course, MODOK, was a really poor choice, and I just didn't think this film worked at all. I thought Jonathan Majors was the highlight, and unfortunately, you know where that happened to go. But when you take all the good parts of the Ant-Man series and you kind of throw them out the window to make some volume CGI schlock that this movie ended up being, it's just a really disappointing affair. It's something I was actually looking forward to, because you're dealing with like the quantum realm, and that could go some interesting places. But the Marvel Cinematic Universe has shown that it's kind of on a downward trajectory, and it worries me a little bit, because it really hasn't produced anything of note outside of maybe Shang-Chi, the current phases, and with everything that Jonathan Majors is going through and everything that's happened, it's just not looking bright for the cinematic universe. And at this point, of this review, the only thing that's worthwhile even talking about with the franchise is, of course, What If, which has put out some really interesting content. But yeah, Ant-Man Quantumania is just not a very good film. So it's the number 2 most disappointing film of the year. And number 1 is a film that I didn't review, but I'm pretty sure you can kind of figure out. So that is... So it's unfortunate that the first Shazam movie was so good that when they brought back everybody from the first movie and then added like Helen Mirren and Lucy Liu and a couple other characters, it was something I was looking forward to. To be fairly honest, I thought it could have been a really good film, and then something happened. I don't know what, I don't know when, I don't know how, but this film stinks. It's disappointing. Most disappointing film I've seen this year. Nothing ever outpaced it outside of Ant-Man Quantumania. And it's just, I don't know if it's just nobody felt like they wanted to do a good film. I don't know if it was the fact that DCEU was kind of ending. I don't know if there's a lot of heart put into this movie. Like I said, these films have heart put into them, but there's just a sluggish nature, a very unfriendly nature, a very boring nature, and just nothing about this film works. It's been the major problem of the DCEU this year, with stuff like this and The Flash and Blue Beetle and of course Aquaman, which I've garnered not really good reviews, and this is the film that kind of started out that year. And I hate to say it, like, I don't mean to be so despondent, but it's just, it really kind of hurts my opinion of comic book movies in general. Like, every once in a while you get like a really good film like a Spider-Man Across Across the Spider-Verse, but then you'll get a lot of schlocky stuff like this. And like I said, they tried. I give them a lot of credit, but it is the most disappointing film I've seen this year. So that is number one on my most disappointing list. And like I said, these aren't terrible films. They're just not very good films. And it was really difficult to even come up with the top 10 worst, because there wasn't a huge amount of like terrible films that I saw, at least in my limited amount of time of reviewing this year, because of the nature of what it's been. But I figured most disappointing really it really shows you that it is very disappointing in a lot of films this year. And then the strike happened and all that stuff. So that's kind of where I lie with the top 10 lowest films of the year, most disappointing, whatever you want to call them. That's kind of where I stand. So overall, it's a list. Don't say that, you know, some of these films I was not at least trying to enjoy. I did, but just didn't work. So anyways, that's my top 10 most disappointing films of 2023. And once again, we'll look forward to 2024. I'm sure there'll be some disappointing films that year, but maybe it'll be a little bit better. The strike's over, and so we'll see what happens. But yeah, there you go. Anyways, we'll continue on tomorrow with, of course, the first portion of my top films of 2023. Have a good one, guys. Peace out.